If you're reading this, it means I broke protocol in a way that can't be undone, and I need this account to exist somewhere outside institutional storage before it's corrected, like everything else was. My name is Margaret, and for 9 years I worked as a licensed practical nurse in a state correctional facility most people don't know exists unless they live close enough to hear the transport helicopters at night. It wasn't maximum security, not the kind of place people imagine when they hear the word prison, but it was heavy in a quieter way, a place where routine mattered more than force, and where the infirmary functioned like a pressure valve for everything the rest of the building didn't want to deal with. I handled intake assessments, medication rounds, emergency triage, and long overnight shifts where the fluorescent lights hummed just loud enough to make you feel like your thoughts were being monitored. By the time this happened, nothing about the environment felt dramatic to me anymore, which is why it took longer than it should have to realize something was wrong. That night shift started like dozens before it, understaffed, overlogged, and already behind before midnight. Intake transfers were scheduled every Tuesday, usually 2 or 3 inmates brought in from county holding, shackled, exhausted, processed through medical clearance before being assigned housing. I was alone in intake that night, which technically violated staffing recommendations, but had become routine due to budget constraints no one ever challenged. The first 2 intakes were unremarkable. Blood pressure elevated, mild dehydration, self-reported anxiety, all things that get documented and forgotten. The 3rd intake arrived late, nearly an hour behind schedule, escorted by 2 officers I didn't recognize, both unusually quiet, avoiding eye contact in a way that felt deliberate rather than rude.
The inmate's file was thin, thinner than it should have been, missing sections that are never missing, and the intake timestamp on the transfer slip read 03:33, even though the wall clock above my desk showed 02:41. I assumed it was a clerical error, the kind that happens when paperwork moves faster than people, and I noted the discrepancy without thinking much of it. The inmate sat on the exam chair without instruction, posture straight, hands relaxed, breathing slow and even, in a way that didn't match the environment or restraints. He didn't look distressed, didn't scan the room, didn't ask questions. When I asked for his name, he gave it immediately, clearly, then repeated it again a few seconds later without being prompted, as if confirming it for someone else. I remember thinking his vitals would tell me more than conversation, so I went through the motions: cuff, pulse oximeter, thermometer, everything reading normal but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, like the numbers were technically acceptable but arranged too neatly. His heart rate stabilized at exactly 66 beats per minute and didn't fluctuate with movement or speech. Oxygen saturation held steady, even when he held his breath longer than necessary. When I asked him if he had any medical conditions, he answered before I finished the question, listing things that weren't conditions so much as observations about his body: heat, pressure, awareness, phrased clinically, like someone reciting chart notes instead of symptoms. I corrected him gently, redirected, and documented what fit protocol, telling myself some inmates rehearse answers to appear compliant. When I entered his data into the system, the intake form lagged longer than usual, then refreshed on its own, repopulating fields I hadn't touched, adding vitals I hadn't measured, all time-stamped 03:33. I assumed the system had glitched, logged out, logged back in, and the same values appeared again, identical down to decimal points, flagged as verified. That was the first moment I felt the urge to look behind me, not because I heard something, but because the room felt occupied in a way it hadn't seconds earlier. The fluorescent lights flickered once, not enough to trigger emergency power, just enough to remind me they could. The inmate watched me without expression, not staring exactly, more like observing my movements with professional interest. When I asked him if he was feeling pain anywhere, he tilted his head slightly and said, "Not yet," which I noted as evasive and inappropriate, but still checked the box for denies pain. As I finished the assessment, the officers shifted near the door, restless, and one of them cleared his throat like he wanted to speak and decided against it. Before they escorted the inmate out, he looked directly at the intake clock mounted beside the door and said, calmly, "You'll want to remember this time," then stood without waiting for instructions. After they left, the room felt suddenly larger, emptier, like pressure had been released too quickly. I sat back down, planning to finish documentation and move on. But when I reviewed the intake summary, the narrative section contained a paragraph I hadn't written, describing physiological responses during initial exposure, using terminology I recognized from textbooks but had never used in a prison intake. I deleted it. The system froze, then restored the text, this time highlighted as locked. I remember laughing quietly, the kind of laugh you use to reassure yourself that stress is playing tricks on you, and I told myself I'd report the glitch in the morning. At 3:33 exactly, the wall clock corrected itself with an audible click, skipping forward nearly an hour without explanation, and the intake form finalized automatically, marked complete under my credentials. That was when I realized I couldn't remember signing. I should have walked straight to the lieutenant's office and reported the clock jump, the locked narrative, the auto-finalized form. But prison work trains you to prioritize what can be proven and ignore what makes you sound unstable. And at that hour, alone, under fluorescent light that had started to feel too aware, I did what people do when they're trying to preserve their own credibility. I tried to make the problem smaller. I reopened the intake template in a different patient chart to see if the system was copying text across records, a known glitch we'd had before when the server lagged during updates. But the template was clean, blank, normal, and the momentary relief that gave me was sharp enough to make the next thing land harder. The temperature in the intake room dropped in a way the thermostat didn't register. Not a dramatic cold, just a subtle thinning of warmth that made my hands feel drier, my knuckles tighter, and I noticed the intake chair cushion was still indented, as if someone were sitting there, even though it was empty. I stood and pressed my palm into the vinyl. It sprang back slowly, but not completely, as if the material were remembering a shape. In the hallway outside, the facility noise continued as usual. Distant doors, a radio squawk, the low churn of ventilation. Yet inside the intake room, those sounds felt filtered, like I was hearing them through a layer of glass. I told myself it was exhaustion, that the clock jump had startled me, that I was spiraling, and I focused on practical tasks, restocking gauze, wiping the counter, logging medication counts. When I opened the controlled cabinet to verify narcotics, I found the count correct, but the log sheet had an extra light at the bottom, in the same handwriting style as mine. Neat, compressed, and I felt my stomach tighten because it included my name, date, and a signature I could almost recognize as my own, except I had not written it, and the time recorded beside it was 0333. I didn't tear it off, didn't crumple it, because something about the act of destroying evidence felt like an invitation to replace it with something worse, so I left it and washed my hands for too long, scrubbing until my skin stung, trying to restore a sense of sequence. The next hour passed in fragments, a diabetic inmate complaining of blurry vision, a minor laceration from kitchen work, an officer needing a blood pressure check after too much caffeine. Ordinary problems should have anchored me, but they only highlighted how abnormal the intake record felt, because every time I tried to let it go, my mind returned to the locked narrative paragraph, describing initial exposure, like I was a subject in my own chart. At 0410, the intake phone rang, which was unusual because transport doesn't call the clinic directly during night shift unless something is actively wrong. And when I picked up, I didn't hear the usual clipped correctional tone. I heard silence, then a faint pattern like a pulse traveling through the line, and I almost hung up before a voice came through, low and calm, asking for me by first name. No one at that facility used my first name on the phone, not inmates, not officers, not supervisors, because familiarity is treated like a risk, and the fact that the voice used it with quiet certainty made my mouth go dry. I asked who it was, and the voice replied, "You already signed," and the line went dead. I stood with the receiver in my hand, listening to dial tone that seemed too loud, and when I set it down, I noticed the clock above the door was drifting again, not jumping, drifting backward by seconds, correcting itself in tiny increments like it was trying to find a precise moment. I checked the wall clock in the hallway. Normal. I checked my watch. Normal. Only the intake clock seemed to be negotiating time. I tried to leave the room, told myself I needed air, a different space, and as I reached for the handle, I felt a brief resistance in my arm. Not physical, more like the hesitation you feel when you realize you're about to walk into a room where something is happening. And when I did open the door, the hallway lights seemed harsher, the air warmer, as if the intake room had been a sealed environment and I'd just broken a boundary. I walked to the nurse station, forced myself into routine, finished charting any other patients, and for a while I almost convinced myself I'd misread the timestamp, that the locked narrative had been a template error, that my stress was projecting meaning onto a bureaucratic mess. Then at 5:07, an officer I knew, McKendrick, reliable, blunt, stopped at my station and asked without his usual sarcasm if I was okay, and the concern in his face hit me harder than any glitch, because it meant I looked as bad as I felt. I said I was fine. He nodded like he didn't believe me and lowered his voice. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, "but intake wasn't supposed to run a third transfer tonight." I asked what he meant, and he glanced down the corridor toward intake like he expected it to be listening. "That guy," he said, "wasn't on the schedule. We got told to escort him like it was already approved. Paperwork came through sealed, time-stamped, done." I asked where the paperwork came from. He shook his head. "Admin says central, central says admin. Everyone acts like it's normal, but it's not." And he stopped, swallowed, and the cameras in that hall looped at 03:33 for 13 minutes. The words tightened my throat. Cameras looping happens, but not like that. Not in one corridor only, not with perfect time alignment. I asked if anyone reviewed the footage. He said they tried, but the files saved as empty placeholders with my name in the metadata, as if I'd requested the export. I felt my blood run cold, not from fear of the thing itself, whatever it was, but from the way it was routing accountability through me, making my identity the container for its actions. I tried to ground myself again by insisting on a mundane explanation, a system error that mistakenly assigned my credentials, a security export that defaulted to the clinic account, some administrative shortcut. McKendrick didn't argue. He just looked at me with the exhausted caution as someone who has learned not to fight reality when reality is wearing a uniform. He told me to stay out of intake for the rest of the shift if I could. I should have listened. Instead, I returned to the intake room because the worst part of fear is not the threat, but the unknown. And I needed to see if the evidence would still be there in the same shape, or if it would change the moment I looked away. When I stepped inside, the air felt thicker, not humid, just dense, and the smell was different, faintly metallic beneath the disinfectant, like pennies warmed in a fist. The intake chair was no longer indented. The counter had been wiped cleaner than I left it, supplies aligned with a precision I hadn't bothered with. The computer screen was awake even though I'd logged off, displaying the same intake record at the top of the queue, highlighted as pending clinician verification, as if the system had decided my earlier complete status wasn't enough. I sat down slowly, hands hovering over the keyboard, and the cursor moved one space to the right on its own, then another, settling in the narrative section as if waiting for dictation. I didn't type. I watched. Letters appeared anyway, not fast, not dramatic, just a steady, patient pace, like someone transcribing a heartbeat. Responses stable, subject compliant, receiver present. I felt heat rise in my face, the anger that comes when something violates you quietly, without spectacle. I slammed the laptop shut, hard, and the intake clock clicked again, correcting itself forward until it read 03:33 exactly, even though the hallway clocks said 05:19. In that instant, the fluorescent lights dimmed to a soft, clinical glow, the kind used during night checks to keep inmates from sleeping too deeply, and I heard a sound from the exam chair, one slow exhale, close, controlled, as if someone had been holding their breath for a long time and had finally been allowed to release it. I froze. The chair was empty. I could see the vinyl, the seams, the buckles hanging unused. The exhale came again, not from my throat, not from the vents, but from inside the room itself, and the intake phone rang once, a single sharp ring that stopped before I could answer. On the computer,
now reopened without my hands touching it, a new field had appeared beneath Chief Complaint. It read in plain text, "Intake, Margaret." I stared at it until my vision blurred, and the most disturbing part was not the implication, but the procedural neatness of it. The way it looked like any other clinical label, as if my body, my history, my routine were simply data points being admitted. I stood up so fast the chair behind me scraped, and the scrape echoed back a half-second late, slightly deeper, like a second chair had moved in sympathy. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the screen because I couldn't trust what I couldn't see. And as I reached for the handle, the lock clicked. Not the heavy corridor lock, but the internal latch of the intake room itself, like it had been engaged from the inside. I pulled. It didn't open. I pulled again, harder. Nothing. The fluorescent lights flickered once, then steadied, and the computer speakers we never used, speakers we kept muted, emitted a low, steady tone that matched a resting pulse. And beneath it, so faint I almost dismissed it, I heard my own voice reciting intake questions in perfect order, except the answers, whispered underneath, were not the inmates. They were mine. The first thing I did was the most childish, the most human response to a locked door in a place that runs on keys and procedures. I tested it again and again, as if repetition could reassert normal rules. The handle stayed rigid under my grip. The latch did not rattle. It wasn't jammed. It was closed with intent. I stepped back and forced my breathing to slow, because panic in a clinical setting is its own kind of emergency, and my training kicked in the way it always did when a situation turned unstable. I told myself there had to be an explanation that fit inside policy. A faulty latch, a power fluctuation, an officer on the other side with the wrong timing, anything. I turned to the wall phone, the internal red handset used for emergencies, and lifted it. Instead of dial tone, there was that same pulse-like audio, a low oscillation that made my molars ache. I hung up immediately, wiped my palm on my scrubs, and felt a cold film of sweat across my fingers that didn't match the room temperature. The computer tone continued, steady as a metronome, and my recorded voice kept speaking intake questions like a training module on loop. Do you have allergies? Have you had thoughts of harming yourself? Any history of seizures? The answers beneath it weren't words at first, just breath, soft exhalations timed to the questions, as if something were practicing timing before committing to language. I backed toward the supply cabinet and grabbed the small trauma flashlight, clicking it on like light could redraw reality. The beam cut across the room, bright and clean, landing on the exam chair, the counter, the metal cabinet doors. Everything looked normal, too normal. The kind of orderly stillness you see in a room that has just been cleaned before an inspection. But when the beam swept over the intake clock, the numbers were wrong. 0333 was still there, but the colon between the digits pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. I glanced to the hallway window embedded in the door, the narrow strip of reinforced glass. Beyond it, the corridor lights were on. The floor gleamed under wax. The far security camera's red indicator light blinked steadily. Normal. I pounded once on the glass and shouted for McKendrick. My voice sounded thin, swallowed by insulation, and for a moment nothing happened. Then the overhead speakers, which shouldn't have been active in intake, clicked softly and played my shout back at me, perfectly, but quieter, as if repeated from a distance. I tried again. The playback came again. It was recording and returning my voice like a reflex. I realized with a sick drop in my stomach that I couldn't trust sound in this room anymore. I moved to the medication cabinet and checked the lock out of habit, and the keyhole was warm, not from my hand, but as if someone had been holding the key from the other side. I pulled the cabinet open and stared at the neatly stacked blister packs, each label bright under fluorescent light, and then my eyes snagged on something that didn't belong. A manila intake envelope, the kind we use for paper records when the system is down, sitting centered on the middle shelf like it had been placed for display. There was no reason for it to be there. I hadn't put it there. It was addressed in printed block letters. To clinic staff. From intake. Timestamp 0333. I didn't touch it right away. I stood there with my hands hovering, as if the paper itself might bite. The tone from the computer softened, then returned, as if acknowledging my attention. Against every instinct, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single page, an intake questionnaire, filled out completely in my handwriting, down to my habitual loop on the G, the way I cross my T too low. But the answers were wrong. Height and weight were close enough to be plausible, but the medical history read like a parody of my life. Prior exposure to confined vibration, allergy to sterile silence, history of compliance under observation. Under chief complaint, it said, remembering too much. My throat tightened. I flipped the page and found a second sheet underneath, this one blank except for one line typed at the top, confirm pain response. I felt my skin crawl. In prison medicine, you learn to recognize tests, malingering, withdrawal, manipulation, but this felt like a different kind of test, designed not to determine truth, but to create it. I forced myself to set the papers down and focus on escape. The room had a ceiling vent. I dragged the rolling stool under it, climbed up, and pushed the vent cover. It didn't budge. Not stuck, sealed. Screws that should have been visible were gone, replaced by smooth metal like the vent had been manufactured that way. I slid down, breath coming faster despite my effort, and the computer tone dipped, almost pleased, then rose again. The intake questions on the loop shifted subtly. The cadence changed. The voice was mine, but steadier, calmer, like the version of me that speaks to frightened patients. On a scale of 1 to 10, it asked, how would you rate your discomfort? The answer beneath it came clearly this time, close to the floor, like someone speaking into the vinyl of the exam chair. Low, then another breath, increasing. I froze. The chair was still empty, but the vinyl surface had depressed slightly, as if weight had settled into it slowly, without sound. The buckles on the restraint straps lifted and fell once, like a small sigh. I stepped back, and my heel bumped the base of the rolling stool. The metal legs scraped, and again that half-second delayed echo returned, deeper, heavier, like a second object moved after mine. I turned sharply, scanning corners, cabinet tops, under the counter. Nothing. Yet the room felt crowded, not with bodies, but with attention. The intake clock clicked again. The colon pulsed. The computer cursor moved on its own, selecting a new field labeled Observation Notes. Text appeared letter by letter. Receiver experiencing disorientation. Recommend extended hold. The phrase extended hold wasn't clinical language. It was custody language. I felt anger surge through the fear, because something in this room was rewriting me as both patient and inmate, collapsing roles until my credentials meant nothing. I grabbed the radio from the charging cradle, our internal unit, and keyed it to call medical control. Static. Then my own voice, calm and professional, answered, "Medical, go ahead." I nearly dropped it. I said my name, my location, and the response came back immediate. "Margaret is in intake. Margaret is stable." I felt bile rise. It wasn't responding to what I said. It was issuing a status update about me. I tried to switch channels. The radio clicked, then settled back, as if refusing alternate frequencies. From the corridor side of the door, I finally heard movement. Footsteps, distant at first, then closer. Relief hit me so fast it made my eyes sting. I moved to the window and looked out. 2 officers walked past at the far end, not looking toward intake, moving with that slow, routine pace of people doing rounds. I banged on the glass hard enough to sting my palm. One of them paused, turned his head, looked directly at me. For a second, I thought he'd seen me, that help had arrived, but his expression didn't change. His eyes slid past me like I was a reflection on the glass, then he continued walking. That was when I noticed the camera above the intake door. Its red indicator was on, but the lens was angled slightly downward, not at the hallway, not at the door, but as if it were pointed inside, at the exact spot where the exam chair sat. The looped voice on the speakers asked another question. "Are you ready to begin intake?" The answer came, not from the chair this time, but from behind my own teeth, a faint vibration that shaped itself into words without my tongue moving. "Yes." I clamped my jaw shut, pressing my fingers against my lips, and the room reacted with a soft electrical sigh, like a system registering a completed step. The lights dimmed to that softer clinical glow again, and on the computer screen, the status changed from pending clinician verification to intake in progress. I stood there, trapped in a medical room that had quietly turned into a receiving chamber, and I understood with a clarity that made my hands go numb. Whatever had come in late, whatever had arrived on paperwork sealed from nowhere, wasn't the inmate. It was the process itself, and it had finally found a nurse who knew how to follow instructions. I don't know what scared me more in that moment, the way my legs wanted to comply, or the way the room behaved like it had already seen me comply enough times to predict the next move. I dug my nails into my palm until pain sharpened the edges of my thoughts, and I said my own name out loud, harshly, like a slap. Margaret. The sound hit the walls and died too cleanly, but it was mine, not a playback. The speaker waited a beat. Then my recorded voice returned, softer, coaxing. "Please sit." And the intake clock's colon pulsed in agreement. I stepped backward instead, toward the sink, because water is one of the oldest resets we have. Wash your hands, start over, restore sequence. And I cranked the faucet open until it blasted cold and loud. The sound of running water filled the room in a way the hum couldn't fully swallow, and for the first time since the door locked, I felt the environment hesitate. The computer tone wavered, the cursor froze mid-drift, and I caught a flicker on the screen like a muscle twitch. I shoved my hands under the stream and forced myself to focus on sensation. Cold, pressure, slipping soap, the sting where my skin was raw from earlier scrubbing. I kept my eyes on the drain as if staring hard enough could anchor me, and I began reciting facts under my breath the way we do with patients who are spiraling. Date, shift, unit, role. 3 things you can see, 2 you can feel, 1 thing you know is true. The intake speaker tried to speak over me. It couldn't quite. Water made the room less compliant. The clock clicked again, not a correction this time, but a strained mechanical noise, like the device was forcing itself to maintain 0333 against something pushing back. I looked up and saw the colon stutter, pulse, 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 like an arrhythmia. The sight gave me a terrible idea. If the room was built around that minute, then disrupting its hold on time might be the only leverage I had. I lunged for the intake clock, yanked it off its mount, and felt resistance the way you feel resistance when you pull something that's wired into more than screws. The plastic casing came free with a crack. The clock hit the floor, and the colon on its display kept pulsing, even face down, bright red against the tile. Immediately, the overhead lights flickered hard, the kind of flicker that usually precedes a full outage, and the speakers erupted in layered audio. My intake questions, my earlier shouts, the calm voice asking for consent, stacked on top of each other until it sounded like a crowded waiting room trapped inside a vent. The computer screen flashed white, then returned with a new prompt. Time source lost. Recalibrating. The word recalibrating made my stomach twist because it implied the system could survive without the clock, could reestablish itself somewhere else. I grabbed the clock and slammed it against the counter, once, twice, until the display shattered and the pulsing colon finally died. For a second, just a second, silence opened like a hole. Real silence. Not muted hallway sound, not filtered ventilation, but true absence, the kind you feel in your ears. The door latch clicked. I spun, heart hammering, and this time, the handle moved. I yanked it open and stumbled into the corridor like I'd been underwater. The hallway lights were brutally bright. The air smelled normal. Wax, stale coffee, faint disinfectant. A nurse from day shift was walking toward me, eyes half-lidded with morning fatigue, and when she saw my face, her expression tightened. "Margaret?" she said, like she wasn't sure it was me. I tried to answer, but my voice came out thin.
Intake door, I started, and she cut me off with a confused frown. Why are you coming out of intake? We haven't used that room since last month. The words hit me like a punch. I turned and looked back. The intake door behind me was there, but the window strip was covered from the inside with opaque film, the kind facilities use when a room is taken out of service. A yellow tag hung from the handle. Do not enter, electrical. The date on it was weeks old. I stared at it, unable to reconcile the locked room I'd just escaped with the official reality taped to the handle.
The day nurse followed my gaze and sighed like I was making her job harder. "Did you go in there again?" she asked, low, irritated but worried underneath. "Admin said no one's supposed to. The cameras don't catch anything in that corridor. It's like the feed drops whenever someone tries." My mouth went dry. McKendrick's earlier words about looping footage flashed through me. I asked her what time it was, and she glanced at the wall clock behind the station. 6:20, she said, the same time my dashboard had refused to leave in AM. I kept staring at the clock behind the station until the numbers stopped looking like time and started looking like a verdict. 6:20. The day nurse watched me like I'd walked out of a migraine, and I could hear the decision forming in her voice. Either I gave her something she could document, or she was going to document me. I tried to explain without using the words that would get me escorted to psych observation. I said the intake door had latched itself and wouldn't open. I said the computer had finalized an intake under my credentials without my signature. I said the clock in that room had jumped and wouldn't match any other clock in the building. She listened, lips pressed together, then walked me to the corridor outside the clinic and pointed to the security seal on the intake door like it was a lesson. The film on the window was old, the warning tag was dated weeks back, and the hinge screws were painted over. "Margaret, that room's dead," she said. "Admin mothballed it after the electrical fire in the ceiling. There's no power run, no speakers, nothing." I told her I'd just been inside. She asked me if I'd slept. I asked her to pull my badge log. At the workstation, she pulled my access history and went quiet. My badge had scanned into intake at 0333, not once, but over and over, minutes apart, each entry marked verified and tied to a location code no map still showed. I said it had to be a system error. She tried to agree, but her eyes kept flicking to the time column as if the repetition was the point. She printed the log for me, then hesitated before handing it over, like paper could be dangerous. I went looking for McKendrick because I needed one thing to stay true. I found him at roll call, laughing with two other officers, alive and ordinary. When I asked him if he'd seen me banging on the intake window, he looked at me like I'd asked if he'd seen a ghost. He told me he'd been home all night, then corrected himself and said he'd been on approved leave for 3 days. The leaf slip he showed me was time-stamped 0333. Something inside me went cold and careful. The pattern wasn't random, it was administrative. It wasn't haunting the building like a story, it was filing me into it. I finished the shift on autopilot and left the facility with the sense that the air itself had been filed and stamped. At home, I spread the printed badge log on my table. When I looked down again, a new line had appeared at the bottom. Discharge status pending. Time 0333. Signature required. That was the moment I quit. Not in a dramatic speech, not with a final confrontation, but the quiet kind of quitting that feels like a confession. I didn't go back. I let the calls ring. I ignored the emails. I told myself distance was the only treatment left. For a week, it almost worked. Then, on the 7th night, my phone buzzed at exactly 0333 with a voicemail from an unknown number. I pressed play and heard my own voice, warm and practiced, the voice I used on terrified inmates and stubborn officers alike. "Nurse Margaret," it said, "please sit." Under the words, there was a faint pulse tone, like a heart monitor trying to find a signal. I didn't sit. I stood in my dark kitchen, listening to the faintest possible fluorescent hum rising from the ceiling light that wasn't even switched on, and I understood the hook the prison had used on me. The intake never needed the room, it only needed the role. If you stayed with me to the end, please leave your like and consider subscribing to the channel, because that's how these records survive long enough for someone else to recognize the pattern. And if there's a chapter 6, it won't be because I went back to the prison. It'll be because at 3:33, intake calls you wherever you are, and eventually, something in you starts to answer. Protagonist